Hey everyone, I'm Arsh and I work as a developer experience engineer at Okteto. In this video, we're going to see how you can use Okteto and Postman together to better write and test the APIs for your application. Postman, for those of you who don't know, is a tool which allows you to test APIs which you write. It provides you an interface where you can mock requests and different types of GET, POST, and other kinds of requests and see the performance of your APIs, the results of the responses you get on sending each type of request. Okteto provides you cloud dev environments, which allows you to write code directly in the cloud in Kubernetes clusters. So the benefit of combining these two tools is that you are able to test the APIs in an actual production-like setting. Now, if you've used Postman before, you know that you would bring up the API locally and then use Postman with it. Now, this approach is better than doing that because this approach brings up your API in an exactly fashion as it would get brought up in production, and then it allows you to better test during more realistic response times and in a similar environment to production. The other advantage of this approach is that developers do not have to spend time configuring things for their APIs. Like if they were developing locally, let's say like any API is not, we don't work with isolated APIs now. There are multiple microservices and APIs often communicate with databases and all that. So just to test an API, a developer would have to bring up a database, an API, and adjoining microservice or whatnot. Whereas with Okteto, developing applications is as simple as writing one command, Okteto up, and directly going to the development phase. So let's see this in action. I have here cloned a to-do list application, and in this video we are going to add a get endpoint which would show us all our to-dos and test the performance of that endpoint with Postman. So to code out our endpoint, we'll start a dev environment in Okteto, and that is as simple as running Okteto up. Now what this command does is it uses all the manifests you have for your application which you used to deploy in production. It uses those manifests and deploys your application to an actual Kubernetes cluster. Once it is done deploying that, it sets up a two-way file synchronization service, and this file synchronization service is what ensures that any code we write, which in our case would be the get endpoint we are about to write, this code gets transferred with the code to a container which is running in the cluster, and we are able to always see the latest changes and the effects of the code we write. So once all of this is done, running Okteto up also gives us access to a container inside that cluster. So you can run all of your commands like this API is written in Golang, so we'll run our make command inside that terminal, and none of that would be happening locally. So everything would be super fast. So let's wait for this to run. We are almost done. And once like the files have been synchronized, you'll see we'll now just have access to a terminal, a shell inside the container which is running in the cluster, and here we go. And to start our API, since this is a Go API, we just run make start, and once we do that, we can go back to our Okteto dashboard, and you can see that our application is deployed and we have an endpoint here which we can use to visit our application. So this is the same endpoint you can feed to Postman and test your application. So let's say we want to test whether we are able to get all to-dos, and I know that the endpoint for the to-dos is at /to-dos. So I can just open a new tab and send a GET request and see what kind of response I get. And I get a 404 page not found, which is very expected because we have not yet added that GET endpoint, right? So let's do that, and then we can see how we can test performance for that endpoint. I cheated right now because like I have the code already commented out. So I'm just gonna go ahead and uncomment this code, and I'll also uncomment our endpoint. And since this is a Go-based application, it does not hot reload, and we'll have to restart our application again. But when we do that, let's go back to our application and add some to-dos. This is a to-do, another to-do. And we can take this same endpoint which we had here and feed that to Postman, and let's see, we see a 404 page not found. Now why is that? Let me check something. Okay, the endpoint is /to-do, so we can just do that and hit refresh, hit send again, and we'll see that our request is getting sent and we are getting all these responses. You can visualize this data in different forms. You can see the raw response, and you can see the prettified one. You can see all the headers which we are getting with that request, and it is all of these things that Postman allows you to do. And you can some of the things which I feel cool about Postman are that you can run tests on your APIs to check their performance. So in this case, let's run one of the sample tests. Let's test if we get a response in less than 1 second or not from our application, and we can hit that and hit send. And it's taking some time, so I think we know that like the test is failed. It took like some 3 seconds, whereas it should have taken 1 second. And you can do things like this now in a more realistic fashion, because if you were not using Okteto and if you were supplying a local endpoint here, like the application brought up on your local host, then you couldn't be sure about the results you would get, because this is not how things would look like in production. Whereas Okteto allowed you to deploy these changes to an actual cluster, so you know that whatever responses you are getting are the exact same things which you will see in production. So let's see what's happening with that application. And I already added a timeout for 3 seconds, which is why it's taking this long. So I'll just uncomment that. And again, had this been like a Node.js application, you could have just set up hot reloading and you would not have to run make start. But you do that, and once you do that, you can try doing this again, and you'll see that a test is now passing, and we know that the response we are getting is in less than a second. And it is things like these where Postman allows you to do things and play around with your APIs, test them, and validate all the responses you are getting. And what I showed in this video was a very simple use case, but I wanted to highlight the utility you get from using Postman and Okteto together, which would not be possible if you were using Postman just with like bringing up your APIs locally. So the number one advantage, according to me, is being able to test your APIs just like you would in production, instead of not being sure that are these response times correct, or if this is what would happen when I push to production, because the local environment no longer accurately mimics what's happening in production these days because of all the tools we use, Kubernetes, Helm, and whatnot. So that's the number one advantage according to me. Second big factor I feel is the improvement to developer experience, which comes from using something like Okteto, because had you been developing this API locally and wanted to test it in Postman, it would not have been as simple as just running one command, right? Because this application uses a database, and if you're working on something more complex, then maybe it's not a single microservice. You're using multiple microservices which are related to each other, and you would have to bring all of them up. Whereas in this video, all we had to do was run one single command, Okteto up, and Okteto deployed our application, and we had an endpoint which we could feed to Postman and test our API. So this was it for this video, and I hope you found it useful. As next steps, I would invite you to go check out Okteto, read about our dev environments, and try them out for yourself. Like, you can head to the documentation, and we have a getting started guide where you can sign up for free on Okteto, and then you can follow this guide along, and it'll take you through an application and how you can develop it on Okteto. And that application also has an API, so I would invite you to use Postman while you're developing that application, use Postman to check that API, check your responses, try improving the response times and mocking requests and all of that fun stuff. And if you ever run into problems or have any questions, feel free to reach out to us on our community website, which is community.okteto.com. And until next time, thank you for watching.